The sound wasn't just loud, it was obscene. A violent metallic scrape followed by the sickening pop of tempered safety glass giving way. For a split second, Dr. Lena Davis thought a tree branch had fallen. But there were no strong winds that sun-drenched Tuesday morning in Northwood Heights, a suburb so quiet and polished it seemed allergic to disorder. Moments before, the only sounds had been the low hum of her brand-new Mercedes engine and the soft elegance of Vivaldi threading through the premium sound system. She had just pulled over to reply to a text from her husband, running late. "See you at the gala tonight. Love you." Her manicured finger was still hovering over the screen when the world detonated. Through a haze of fractured reflections, she saw a man's face, pale, angry, twisted into something feral, looming beside her car. He wasn't holding a baton or even a flashlight. In his hand was a pair of long-handled tree pruners, their serrated blades glittering in the sunlight. Officer Frank Miller. His expression was pure rage molded into human form. He had used the pruners as a battering ram, and now he was using the sharp tip to peel away the shards of her driver's side window. "Get out of the car," he bellowed, his voice a gravel-coated roar that tore through the serene morning air. Spittle flew from his lips, catching the light like tiny, furious diamonds. Lena froze, her mind struggling to assemble meaning from chaos. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't rolled a stop sign. She was parked legally on a public street, in the neighborhood she had moved into only 3 weeks earlier. "Officer," she began, her voice steady, despite the cold adrenaline flooding her veins. "What is the meaning of this? What have I done?" Miller laughed, a sound without humor and ugly vibration of contempt. He reached through the shattered window, hand groping for the lock. "Let's start with loitering in a residential neighborhood. Casing houses, maybe? Looking for a score?" He jerked his head toward the stately brick homes lining the street. "People like you don't belong here. You stick out." The phrase hung between them, heavy and poisonous. People like you. Something ancient stirred inside Lena. A slow, weary anger she'd spent a lifetime mastering. She was a Yale-educated sociologist, a published author, a respected academic whose work dissected systemic inequality. She had lectured on bias, written books about it, trained entire departments to see it. Yet here she was, reduced to a category, a stereotype, an unwelcome presence on her own street. Her car, a gift from her husband to celebrate her latest book deal, was now reimagined by this man as a symbol of criminality. His mind had already built a story, a black woman in a luxury car, therefore guilty. His partner, a younger, soft-faced officer named Jenkins, stood back near the patrol car. A faint smirk curved his mouth as he held up his phone, not to document evidence but to capture entertainment. "I live here," Lena said, her tone dropping into calm, deliberate clarity. "My house is 3 blocks down, 1214 Magnolia Drive. I just moved in." "Sure you do," Miller sneered, finally managing to pop the lock. He yanked the door open so violently it slammed against its hinges. "And I'm the King of England." "Get out now." "Hands where I can see them." He lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm. His fingers dug deep into the muscle beneath her silk blouse, the fabric tearing under the force of his grip. She stumbled as he dragged her out of the driver's seat, her knees scraping against the pristine asphalt. Her leather briefcase flew open, scattering papers, the lecture notes she'd spent the weekend perfecting across the spotless street. "You're making a mistake, officer," she said, her voice low, measured, unflinching. Her eyes locked onto his. She refused to look away, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing fear. "The only mistake," Miller growled, twisting her arm behind her back with mechanical precision, "was you thinking you could roll into a neighborhood like this and not get noticed?" The cold bite of handcuffs clamped around her wrists. He leaned in close, his breath hot and stale, reeking of coffee and malice. "This isn't your part of town, sweetheart. We keep things clean here. Don't want your kind bringing problems to our doorstep." He shoved her toward the patrol car, pushing her head down to force her inside. Her cheek brushed the hot metal roof, the sting of heat mixing with humiliation. For a brief moment, her reflection caught in the Mercedes side mirror. Her torn blouse, smudged face, bound wrists, and beyond that reflection, the jagged wound of her shattered window. Miller hadn't just broken glass. He had shattered the illusion that her achievements, her degrees, her awards, her address could ever fully insulate her from a man with a badge and a heart full of hate. He had no idea what he'd just unleashed. At the precinct, the day's ordinary hum went on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Phones rang. Officers laughed over burnt coffee, paperwork shuffled beneath fluorescent lights. The violence that detonated in Northwood Heights was already dissolving into bureaucratic routine. In the break room, Miller leaned back in a cracked vinyl chair, a paper cup of coffee in hand, recounting his version of the morning's events to two eager colleagues. Jenkins hovered beside him, nodding at every exaggerated beat. "So there she is," Miller began, puffing himself up. Brand new Benz, parked all suspicious, looked like a dealer's girlfriend or high-end hooker. You know the type. No reason to be in Northwood Heights unless she's up to something. He conveniently skipped over the part where Lena was sitting quietly, reading a message. I approached the vehicle. Professional as always, he continued, voice brimming with false modesty. She immediately gets hostile. Starts screaming about her rights, calling me a racist pig. Typical, Jenkins added, eager to please. She was totally unhinged, Chief. When Rick asked for her license, she started reaching for something in the glove box. Could have been a gun for all we knew. Their story, polished and practiced, fell easily into the pattern of so many before it. An unarmed citizen magically transformed into a threat to justify force. Police Chief Brody, whose gut strained his uniform buttons and whose career thrived on looking the other way, listened with an expression of solemn concern. He'd heard versions of this story for years. A suspicious black person in a nice area, a confrontation, a claim of resistance, an arrest neatly tied up in a report that Internal Affairs would rubber stamp. It was the kind of paperwork that kept everything tidy. So the window, Brody said, as though inquiring about a broken fence post. What happened there? She locked the doors, refused lawful orders to exit. Miller replied smoothly, the lie sliding from his tongue without effort. I had to gain entry using available tools. Standard procedure for a barricaded suspect. He said it as if tree pruners were part of departmental equipment. The fact that they were his own gardening tools from his car's trunk would never make it into the official report. And her injuries? Brody asked, scanning a preliminary form. Resisting arrest, Jenkins said quickly. She fought us the whole way. Threw herself on the ground. We've got it all on video. He patted his phone, confident in the doctored clip that began after the violence. The missing 30 seconds. Miller's unprovoked rage. The slurs, the window shattering, would remain conveniently unrecorded. His body cam, Miller would later claim, suffered an unfortunate battery malfunction. Brody nodded slowly. He knew the truth. Everyone in that room did. But Miller's numbers were high. He kept the crime rate down in neighborhoods the mayor cared about. The complaints from his kind of suspects were just the cost of doing business. All right, the chief said finally, voice a gravelly growl. Write it up. Emphasize her non-compliance and perceived threat. Note the suspicious nature of her presence. Book her on resisting arrest, failure to comply, and, hell, throw in destruction of property. Her own property? Jenkins asked, half laughing. Brody almost smiled. Exactly. It'll stick. They always plead out to avoid more trouble. Miller grinned, wolfish satisfaction spreading across his face. The blue wall was solid. The system would protect him as it always did. He didn't even bother learning the woman's name. In his mind, she was already filed away. A nameless case, a statistic, a lesson taught. He couldn't know that miles away a phone was ringing in the governor's mansion. That the woman sitting silently in one of his holding cells was not a random suspect, but the wife of the most powerful man in the state. He couldn't imagine that the true lesson, the one about power, truth and justice, was about to turn back on him with the full force of history. For now, he leaned back, sipped his coffee, and smirked. Another day's work, he thought. Another problem handled. But even in the sterile hum of the precinct, something in the air had shifted, quiet. Invisible, irreversible. Dr. Lena Davis, sitting alone behind cold metal bars, was already planning her next move. and when she rose, the world around her would never be the same again. The holding cell smelled of bleach, sweat, and hopelessness, a heavy institutional stench that clung to the walls like mildew. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flickering as though it too was exhausted by the monotony of the place. Dr. Lena Davis sat motionless on the cold concrete bench, her wrists now cuffed in front of her, a minor concession after processing. The torn silk sleeve of her blouse hung loose at the shoulder, and her knees ached from where she'd hit the asphalt. But her spine remained straight, her posture deliberate. She would not fold. Not here. Across the narrow corridor, an officer chewed gum while filling out paperwork, occasionally glancing at her with detached disdain. She had seen that look before, the way certain people glanced at her in faculty meetings when she spoke too confidently, or at conferences when she dismantled the myth of meritocracy. But this was different. This look didn't contain discomfort or disbelief. It contained satisfaction. When she'd been booked, the desk sergeant, a thick-set man named Ali, had looked her up and down with open contempt. "Another one who thinks a fancy car gives her a pass," he'd muttered to a colleague, loud enough for her to hear. When she refused to answer their questions without a lawyer present, his expression had curdled into something darker. "Playing tough, huh?" Miller had sneered, shoving her toward the fingerprinting station. "You'll be begging for a public defender before the day's out." The flash from the mugshot camera had been blinding, sterile, clinical, reducing her to a file number in a system built to strip people of identity. They had logged her purse, her briefcase, and her phone with performative efficiency, as if recording possession somehow sanitized the violence that had preceded it. 2 hours passed. Lena's calm was not a performance. It was armor. Every breath, every deliberate silence was a calculation. Panic was a luxury. Rage was a weapon she would save for later. When the guard finally appeared at her cell door, jangling his keys, his voice was flat with disinterest. "You get one phone call. Local numbers only. 5 minutes." He led her to a wall-mounted phone streaked with grime. She ignored the graffiti-scrawled ads for fast bail bonds and discount legal help. She didn't need any of them. She needed one person, the only one who could shift the ground beneath this entire precinct. She dialed from memory. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered, warm but brisk. "This is David." "David," she said evenly. "It's Lena." There was silence, heavy, alive. "Lena, where are you?" "You missed the luncheon." I was starting to worry. "I'm at the Northwood Heights Police Precinct," she said, her tone precise. "There's been a misunderstanding." The silence on the line sharpened. "Are you hurt?" His voice had changed. No longer the gentle cadence of a husband, but the controlled gravity of a man accustomed to issuing orders that carried weight. "I have some scrapes and bruises," she replied. "They've charged me with resisting arrest and failure to comply." "Who are the officers?" "The arresting officer is named Frank Miller. His partner is Jenkins. Their supervisor is Chief Brody." She delivered each name like a citation, like data points in a report. "Stay calm," David said, his voice now stripped of all softness. "Don't say another word to them, not one. I'm handling this." "I know," she said quietly. "I'll see you soon." The call ended. The guard smirked as he led her back to the cell. "Called your baby daddy to bail you out?" he asked, a sneer twisting his lips. Lena looked at him expressionless. She didn't respond. There was no point arguing with arrogance that mistook cruelty for power. She sat down again, hands folded neatly in her lap. The air around her vibrated faintly, as if reality itself was shifting. She didn't know exactly what steps her husband would take, but she knew the shape of what was coming. Phone calls to the Attorney General, the head of the state police, perhaps even the regional FBI director. The machinery of accountability was already in motion. Meanwhile, across the hall, the same officers congratulated themselves. In the precinct's break room, under the hum of a soda machine and the smell of burnt coffee, Officer Frank Miller was riding the high of self-justification. He was in his element, center of attention. swaggering in his uniform like a man who believed the law existed to mirror his own biases. So there she was, he told two officers lounging across from him. Brand new Benz, sitting like she owned the place. Told you Northwood's been getting sketchy lately. You can't let him get too comfortable. Can't be too careful, one officer chuckled. Exactly. You give 'em an inch, they take a neighborhood. Jenkins leaned against the counter, sipping coffee. She was wild, Chief. When Rick asked for her ID, she started reaching for something. Could have been a gun. We had to act fast. Miller nodded gravely, his face sculpted into the mask of professional restraint. We followed protocol. De-escalated as much as possible, but she wasn't cooperating. Had to gain control. It was a story he'd told before, with small variations depending on the race, gender, or neighborhood of the suspect. Chief Brody sat across from them, the picture of dispassionate authority. He knew the routine. Miller's arrest reports always followed the same template. Non-compliance and furtive movement a possible weapon. His record was full of them, and yet each case evaporated before it reached court. So, Brody said, pretending to study his notes, she locked the doors? Yep, Miller said. Refused to roll down her window, ignored lawful orders. I had to use a tool of opportunity to gain entry. Brody raised an eyebrow. Tool of opportunity? Tree pruners, Jenkins offered helpfully. From his trunk. Worked better than a baton. There was a brief, uncomfortable laugh. Brody didn't press. And her injuries? Self-inflicted, Miller said. She fought like hell. Tried to pull away. Scratched her knees up when she went down. We got it all on video. The chief leaned back, folding his arms. Body cam? Battery died, Miller said without missing a beat. But Jenkins got it on his phone. Brody sighed. He'd heard that excuse 100 times. It didn't matter. It was paperwork now, and paperwork was malleable. All right, he said. Write it up. Keep it clean. Non-compliance, resisting arrest, public safety concern. Add property damage, Jenkins frowned. Her car window? Brody almost smiled. Her own property. It'll stick. They all laughed. To them, this wasn't injustice. It was a performance, a ritual of authority. They didn't see Lena as a human being. She was a case file. A small victory in their unspoken war against people who made them feel inferior. When they finally left to draft their synchronized reports, Brody lingered. He knew exactly who Frank Miller was. A bully with a badge. A lawsuit waiting to happen. But Miller's numbers looked good. His proactive policing made the neighborhood donors happy, and that was what mattered. Across the station, Lena sat in silence, still as a storm on the verge of forming. Through the narrow window above her, she could see a square of pale afternoon sky, peaceful, almost mocking. The guard passed by again, muttering, "You people never learn." She didn't respond. She was beyond their reach now. When the hour ended, Miller and Jenkins strutted through the corridor, their laughter echoing. Jenkins scrolled through the video on his phone, grinning. This is gold, man. You should see her face when you drag her out. Might even go viral. Miller smirked. Keep it handy. If she files a complaint, we've got our version. Their confidence was a fortress built on lies, cemented by a system that rewarded brutality and punished humility. They had no idea that fortress was already cracking, that a storm was moving toward them, swift, deliberate, and merciless. In the governor's mansion, the phone lines were burning. Calls to the Attorney General, calls to the State Police Commissioner, calls that carried the weight of office and the precision of vengeance. Back at the precinct, Chief Brody leaned in his chair, sipping cold coffee, reviewing the draft reports. Each was immaculate, each perfectly aligned, a ballet of bureaucratic deceit. He signed them with a bored flourish, never once considering the possibility that this time someone might fight back. Outside, the evening light turned gold over Northwood Heights. The manicured lawns glowed like pages in an expensive brochure. It looked peaceful, untouched. But beneath that calm surface, fault lines had begun to form. The illusion of order, the one men like Miller lived to protect, was crumbling, and in a small, gray cell Dr. Lena Davis sat with her eyes open, unblinking, the embodiment of quiet fury and intelligence. The men who mocked her would soon learn that she wasn't a statistic. She was a reckoning. And her silence wasn't submission. It was the stillness before the storm. The fluorescent light above Dr. Lena Davis's cell buzzed like a trapped wasp, flickering in and out as if struggling to stay alive. The sound reminded her of how systems fail, slowly, predictably, until collapse becomes inevitable. She sat, in the same position she had held for hours. Upright, composed, hands folded neatly on her lap. Her wrists were raw where the cuffs had bitten, but she refused to rub them. Pain was temporary. Dignity was not. Across the booking area, 2 officers were laughing at something on a phone. The sound was brittle, performative, the kind of laughter people use to feel powerful. Lena closed her eyes and took a slow breath. Her body felt heavy, but her mind was razor-sharp. Every detail of what had happened, the glass, the words, the look in Officer Miller's eyes, was already catalogued, preserved in perfect sequence. She didn't yet know how, but she would make the truth matter. The guard who had escorted her earlier ambled past the cell door, holding a half-empty coffee cup. "Your 5 minutes are up," he said lazily. "No more calls for a while." "That's fine," Lena replied softly, meeting his eyes. 5 minutes was all I needed. He frowned as if confused by her composure. It wasn't the reaction he expected. Most people in this cell were angry, pleading, broken. But this woman, this stranger in the torn silk blouse, sat like a queen in exile, calm and waiting for something unseen. What she was waiting for, in fact, was already in motion. At that same moment, in the marble corridors of the governor's mansion, chaos had broken through the usual order. Phones rang, aides hurried between offices, voices collided in clipped tones of urgency. Governor David Thompson stood behind his desk, his jaw set in a line so tight it could have cut glass. The call from Lena had been short, less than 2 minutes, but it had detonated like a grenade in his world. He had listened to her words, carefully, forcing himself to remain composed even as fury boiled beneath his calm exterior. Now he was fully in command mode, his voice low and lethal as he issued orders. "Get me Arthur Vance," he said to his chief of staff. "Now. Not his office, him. Direct line." "Yes, sir." "And the state police commissioner. I want the Northwood Heights precinct frozen." Nobody leaves. Nobody deletes anything. Body cam footage, patrol logs, radio calls, all of it secured under state authority. Within minutes, the Attorney General was on the line. "Arthur," Thompson said, "we have a situation. Northwood Heights PD. A woman was assaulted, falsely arrested, Officer Frank Miller. Partner Jenkins, Chief Brody signed off." "I see," Vance replied evenly. "And the victim?" "Dr. Lena Davis," the governor said, his voice cooling to ice. "My wife." A beat of silence followed, and then the Attorney General's tone changed completely. "Understood. I'll take it from here. We'll need a warrant for the body cam backups and any neighborhood surveillance footage. I'll have the state police move immediately." "Make it fast," the governor said. "And Arthur, this doesn't leak, not yet." He hung up, staring at the photograph on his desk. Lena, smiling under a cascade of sunlight, taken at last year's education summit. The thought of her, sitting behind bars, handled, humiliated, reduced to a suspect, filled him with a kind of fury he had never felt before. But this wasn't about vengeance, not yet. It was about precision. At the precinct, Miller was still basking in his imagined victory. He had finished writing his report and was swaggering toward the vending machine when Jenkins approached. "Got word from Brody," Jenkins said, half grinning. "He's signing off, says he'll call the DA's office to confirm charges. Looks like we're good." "Of course we're good," Miller muttered, tearing open a bag of chips. "Just another day." Neither man noticed the phone call. The desk sergeant took moments later, short, quiet, his posture straightening as he listened. His face drained of color. When he hung up, his hand shook slightly. "Chief Brody," he called out. "You might want to take this. It's the State Attorney General's office." Brody frowned, lumbering toward his office with an irritated grunt. The sergeant's eyes flicked nervously to the holding cells. Something was shifting in the air. He couldn't name it, but he felt it, a tightening of the atmosphere, like pressure before a storm. Back in her cell, Lena felt it too. The guard passed again, this time avoiding her gaze. He had been smirking before. Now he seemed uncertain. It wasn't that he knew what was happening, he didn't. But the equilibrium of power had tilted, and even he could feel it. Lena stared at the small crack in the concrete wall opposite her bench. The line ran jaggedly from floor to ceiling, splitting the gray surface like a wound. She traced it with her eyes, thinking of how power always tried to present itself as seamless, impenetrable, until one small truth began to widen the fissures. A voice carried faintly from the hallway. "She's the governor's wife," someone whispered. "The governor's... what?" The words spread like static. Within minutes, the precinct that had hummed with laughter and arrogance fell into uneasy silence. Chief Brody emerged from his office, his face pale, sweat beading at his temples. He barked an order for Miller and Jenkins to report to him immediately. The two men exchanged a glance, uneasy now. "What's going on?" Miller muttered. Brody didn't answer. He didn't have to. They could feel it, the same invisible shift Lena had sensed hours earlier. Something larger than all of them had awakened. In the small, grimy cell, Lena heard footsteps approaching. The same guard who had mocked her now stood awkwardly at the door, fumbling with the keys. "You, might want to get ready," he said hesitantly. "Chief wants to see you upstairs." Lena rose slowly, smoothing her torn sleeve as if preparing for a lecture, not a confrontation. Her voice was even. "Am I being released?" The guard didn't answer. He simply avoided her eyes. As she stepped into the hallway, the entire station seemed to hold its breath. Every conversation died mid-sentence, every movement slowed. Officers who had barely noticed her before now stared, suddenly aware of who she was. Through the glass window of the chief's office, she saw Brody on the phone, his expression contorted, one hand tugging at his collar. Miller and Jenkins stood nearby, stiff and pale, no longer laughing. And for the first time since the glass shattered that morning, Lena allowed herself the faintest smile, a smile without joy, without triumph, but full of understanding. The reckoning had begun, and it had started exactly as she intended, quietly, methodically, without a raised voice or a single unnecessary word. In another life, in another story, she might have screamed, begged, or cursed the injustice. But Lena Davis knew better. Real power didn't shout. It waited. It planned. It spoke last. As the guard led her toward the conference room, the faint hum of the precinct's radio chatter filled the air. Snippets of confusion, orders to hold communication, whispers of an investigation. Outside, the first hint of evening light turned the sky over Northwood Heights a deep, molten gold. Somewhere in the distance a siren wailed, a sound of warning, of something approaching. By the time the door closed behind her, Dr. Lena Davis had already reclaimed the dignity they had tried to strip away. She stood not as a detainee, not as a victim, but as the calm center of a gathering storm. A woman who had learned through a lifetime of study and survival that sometimes the most devastating act of defiance is stillness. And as the echo of her husband's orders rippled through the state, the walls around Northwood Heights Police Department began to tremble. The storm was coming, and none of them were ready. The hearing room smelled of stale air and paper, bureaucracy trapped in a box. The walls were painted the same color as resignation, a beige so neutral it seemed designed to dull emotion. A single ceiling fan turned lazily above the rectangular table where the participants sat, pretending the day was ordinary. It was not ordinary. To Chief Gerald Brody, the internal hearing was supposed to be routine, a quiet procedural step before filing the official charges. It would take an hour, maybe two. They'd record testimony, check boxes, and move forward. But something in the air felt wrong from the moment he walked in. The sergeant outside had looked pale. The 80 had arrived earlier than expected. Even the officers milling about the hall were whispering, glancing toward the door of the small conference room as if something, or someone, was about to arrive. Brody tried to shrug it off. He was an old hand at this kind of cleanup. At one end of the table sat Officer Frank Miller, his posture perfectly practiced. Upright, uniform pressed, expression sober and dutiful. Every inch of him was performing authority. Beside him was Officer Jenkins, his nervous energy barely masked behind forced calm. Their statements were ready, coordinated word for word. They'd done this before. At the opposite end of the table sat Dr. Lena Davis. Her torn blouse had been replaced with a clean shirt given to her by the duty nurse, though her wrists still bore faint red marks. Her composure was absolute. She was flanked by a tired, underprepared public defender who had been assigned her case less than an hour ago. He hadn't said much. There was little he could say. Between them sat a young assistant district attorney named Peterson, representing the state. Fresh out of law school, eager to appear professional, he was already out of his depth. He didn't yet realize he was standing on the edge of a political earthquake. Chief Brody cleared his throat. This is a preliminary hearing regarding the arrest of one Dr. Lena Davis on charges of resisting arrest, failure to comply, and destruction of property. Officer Miller, you may begin your statement. Miller nodded with a look of feigned reluctance as though he regretted having to recount something unpleasant. Chief Mr. Peterson, he began, voice measured, at approximately 10:15 this morning, while on routine patrol in Northwood Heights, my partner and I observed a suspicious vehicle parked on Oak Street. The area has had recent break-ins, so we initiated a standard investigatory stop. He paused, eyes flicking toward Lena before continuing. The vehicle, a late-model Mercedes-Benz, appeared out of place in that neighborhood. I approached the driver, who refused to identify herself. She became verbally abusive, calling me a racist and threatening legal action. Lena watched him without blinking, her face unreadable. She locked the doors, Miller continued, and ignored repeated lawful commands to step out. I observed her reaching toward the center console, potentially for a weapon. Fearing for my safety, I was forced to breach the driver's window using an available tool to gain control of the situation. He sat back slightly, a man confident his words would be believed. He had spoken the script so many times it came out as second nature. The subtle emphasis on safety, the careful avoidance of any detail that hinted at his own aggression. Peterson nodded, scribbling notes he barely understood. And the suspect's reaction? She resisted, Miller said quickly. Attempted to pull away, kicked, screamed. My partner and I used minimal force to restrain her. We acted in full accordance with department procedure. Jenkins took his turn next, parroting the same phrases. Volatile situation, non-compliant subject, officer safety. The two men's testimonies were synchronized like choreography. When they finished, Chief Brody leaned back satisfied. Thank you, officers. Your professionalism under difficult circumstances is noted. Dr. Davis, do you have anything you'd like to add before we conclude? The young public defender shifted nervously beside her, expecting an outburst. A protest, maybe a plea. But Lena stood slowly instead. The clink of her handcuffs echoed softly through the room. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady, clear, academic. I'd like to thank Officer Miller for his creativity. His narrative, while entirely fictional, was quite detailed. Brody frowned. Dr. Davis, this isn't the time. Oh, it's precisely the time, she interrupted, her tone still calm. Because before this hearing proceeds any further, I have a few procedural requests. Peterson blinked, caught off guard. Requests? Yes. I would like the committee to produce the complete, unedited body camera footage from both officers, from the moment they first observed my vehicle until I was placed in their patrol car. I'd also like the street surveillance footage from homes on Oak Street, particularly from number 312, which I believe has a high-definition ring camera facing the road. The silence that followed was electric. Miller's smirk faltered. His pulse thudded in his ears. He had completely forgotten the ring camera. He'd been so focused on his own control of the narrative, his doctored clip, his malfunctioning body cam, that he hadn't considered the eyes of the neighborhood itself. Brody tried to regain control. That's highly irregular. Officer testimony is sufficient for this stage. We don't typically review video unless requested by Internal Affairs. Lena tilted her head slightly. With respect, Chief, the officers have accused me of verbal abuse, threatening behavior, and erratic movement. Those are serious claims. The objective video evidence I've requested would either corroborate or disprove them. Surely, if their account is accurate, they'd welcome its release. Her reasoning was flawless, a rhetorical trap disguised as civility. Peterson shifted uneasily in his chair. He wasn't stupid. He'd only been here 30 minutes, but he could already sense something was wrong. The way the officers avoided eye contact, the vague phrases in their reports, it smelled like perjury. Chief, Peterson said quietly, the request is reasonable. If the footage exists, we should review it. Brody's face flushed. The footage isn't available. Why not? Miller spoke up, his voice brittle. My body cam malfunctioned. Battery failure. It happens. How convenient, Lena said, her tone almost gentle. Then perhaps Officer Jenkins's footage will suffice. I understand his device was functioning, though the version submitted to the department appears to start after my window was already broken. I'd like to see the full file. Jenkins swallowed hard. His mouth went dry. The unedited video contained everything. The casual racism, the laughter, the moment Miller pulled the tree pruners from his trunk. Before anyone could answer, Lena added, and as this hearing is now a matter of public record, I formally request a complete copy of Officer Miller's complaint history for the duration of his employment with this department. Brody's composure finally cracked. That's out of order, he snapped. This isn't a trial. The charges against me, Lena said evenly, are based entirely on Officer Miller's credibility. If his history shows a pattern of excessive force or racial bias, that is directly relevant to determining the truth. Her voice was soft, but it carried like thunder. The public defender beside her stared in open awe. He'd never seen anyone turn a hearing into a courtroom with such quiet authority. Brody opened his mouth to object, but the double doors at the far end of the room swung open with a sharp, echoing crack. Every head turned. Two men in dark suits entered first, moving with the fluid confidence of professionals accustomed to command. Earpieces glinted against their collars. They stepped aside, holding the doors wide. Through them strode the Attorney General of the state, Arthur Vance, and beside him, Governor David Thompson. The room froze. Peterson went pale. Brody stood halfway from his chair, words stuttering out of his mouth. Miller felt the blood drain from his face, his stomach hollowing into ice. Governor Thompson's presence filled the small room like gravity itself. He didn't glance at the officers, nor at Brody, nor at the trembling ADA. His eyes went straight to Lena. She met his gaze and exhaled, the faintest flicker of relief passing through her posture. He crossed the room in silence. Each step was measured, controlled. When he reached her, he placed his hands gently on her shoulders and bent close enough that only she could hear. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" he asked softly. The word sweetheart detonated in the air. Every man in the room seemed to flinch at once. Miller's mind went blank, the title governor's wife crashing against the lies he had written hours earlier. Jenkins's knees felt weak. Peterson's pen slipped from his fingers. Brody's face turned a shade of gray that no human skin should reach. Governor Thompson straightened, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but the calm of a man about to bring down a building. "Chief Brody," he said, "perhaps you can explain why my wife is sitting in your conference room in handcuffs," Brody stammered. "Governor, there was a report, sir, we believed." "A report," Thompson repeated. "I'm sure it was very thorough." He turned toward Miller, his gaze sharp enough to cut. "Officer Miller, is it? You're the one who smashed the window of my wife's car and dragged her into the street?" Miller's throat closed. His head moved in a faint, jerky nod. "I see," the governor murmured. He looked to the Attorney General. "Arthur?" Vance stepped forward, holding a tablet. "Yes, Governor. My office has obtained a warrant for all surveillance data from Oak Street, as well as automatic cloud backups of body cam footage. Despite reports of a malfunction, the devices upload encrypted copies to the county server. We've already recovered the files." He turned the tablet so everyone could see. The room filled with the silent, high-definition truth. The Ring camera footage showed Lena's Mercedes pulling over. It showed her texting, calm and unthreatening. It showed Miller's patrol car pull in behind her. Then, without warning, Miller retrieved the tree pruners from his trunk and swung, glass exploding into sunlight. The Attorney General tapped the screen again, and the audio began. The unedited body cam feed from Jenkins captured their voices before the stop. Miller's drawl. "Look at this one. Brand new Benz. Bet you $100 it's stolen." Jenkins's laugh. "Nah, that's bait. She's trolling for a rich white husband. Let's remind her she's fishing in the wrong pond." The recording ended there, the silence afterward stretching like a canyon. No one moved. Vance's voice broke the stillness. "Officers Frank Miller and Eric Jenkins, you are under arrest for felony assault, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and perjury." He turned to Brody. "Chief Brody, you are being placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation into departmental misconduct and obstruction." The two plainclothes agents stepped forward. The sound of handcuffs locking around Miller's wrists was sharp, definitive, an echo of the same metal he had used against Lena only hours earlier. Governor Thompson took the key from one of the agents and unlocked his wife's cuffs himself. He rubbed her bruised wrists gently before folding her hands in his. The room was silent except for the murmur of Miranda rights being read to Miller and Jenkins. The irony was complete. The protectors, now criminals, their lies crumbling in the face of unflinching evidence. For the first time all day, Lena exhaled fully. Not relief exactly, but release, a quiet acknowledgement that truth, though battered, had survived. The governor turned back to the room, his voice once again calm, controlled. "Deadly precise, this hearing is over," he said, "but the reckoning has only just begun." No one dared to disagree. Miller was led from the room, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Jenkins followed, trembling. Chief Brody sank into his chair, his authority evaporating into the stale air. Lena remained standing, tall, her posture regal despite the fatigue. She didn't look at the officers being dragged away. She looked instead at the cracked beige wall behind them, at the faint hairline fracture running down from the ceiling, like the crack in her cell, like the one in the system itself. It had taken one swing of tree pruners to break her window. But it would take only one truth to bring down everything behind it, and that truth finally was free. The air in the Northwood Heights precinct was heavy with a silence that didn't belong there. For years this building had thrummed with a kind of unchecked arrogance, the clatter of boots, the low rumble of jokes that weren't really jokes, the smell of burnt coffee and authority. Now that familiar rhythm was gone. The laughter had stopped. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was the only music left. Inside the small hearing room, no one moved. The truth, raw, visual, undeniable, still hung in the air, flickering on the Attorney General's tablet screen. The footage had exposed everything. The smirk, the racial slur, the swing of the pruners. It had stripped away the pretense of law and order and laid bare the rot beneath it. Governor David Thompson stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding yet restrained, like a storm holding itself back from thunder. Beside him, Attorney General Arthur Vance was all professionalism, a prosecutor who had spent a lifetime watching men in power crumble the moment evidence began to speak. Across from them, Chief Gerald Brody sat hunched in his chair, his uniform suddenly too tight. his authority dissolving by the second. He opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but no words came out. His tongue seemed to have turned to dust. Governor Thompson's gaze swept the room with measured calm. "Chief," he said quietly, "I'll ask you one last time. Perhaps you can explain why my wife was sitting in your precinct, handcuffed and humiliated while your officers fabricated a report against her." Brody swallowed hard. The instinct to grovel battled with the instinct to deflect. He settled on something in between. "Governor, I had no idea she was your wife. The report came in from Officer Miller and—" Thompson cut him off with a flick of his hand. "And you believed him." The words weren't shouted, but they hit like a hammer. The governor turned toward Vance. "Arthur, continue." Attorney General Vance nodded and placed the tablet on the table so that everyone could see it. The ring footage is corroborated by the unedited body cam backup. Both recordings clearly show Officer Miller initiating force without cause and using racially derogatory language. Officer Jenkins can be heard laughing and encouraging him. Neither officer ever identifies Dr. Davis as a potential threat or requests backup. In fact, she remains calm and seated until Miller shatters the window. Vance looked at Miller, whose hands now trembled in the steel cuffs at his back. "You didn't just break a window, officer. You broke the law and you violated your oath. You disgraced your badge." Miller's jaw flexed, but his voice failed him. The Attorney General continued, methodical and merciless. "Officer Miller, Officer Jenkins, you are under arrest for felony assault, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and perjury. Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty and remanded to state custody." The two state troopers standing at the door moved forward. Their professionalism was absolute. They didn't gloat or sneer as they took hold of the disgraced officer's arms. The process was clinical, practiced. The sound of the cuffs closing around Miller's wrists echoed through the room, with poetic symmetry, the same sound that had marked the moment of Lena's humiliation that morning. "Governor." Thompson didn't look away. He wanted Miller to feel the weight of being seen, not as an officer, not as a man with authority, but as what he truly was, a coward who had confused cruelty for strength. Lena sat silently beside her husband, her hands resting in her lap, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch when Miller's eyes darted toward her, pleading for something, understanding, maybe forgiveness. But there was nothing there for him. Only clarity. The governor stepped forward, his voice steady. "You taught my wife that she needed to learn her place." He paused, letting the words settle. "Today you're going to learn yours." Miller's face drained of color. Jenkins looked close to tears. "Governor," Brody croaked, rising halfway from his chair, his voice trembling. "Please, you must understand, I didn't know the details. If you'd realized she was someone important." Thompson's voice sharpened. "If you'd realized she had power? Tell me, Chief, what would you have done differently if she'd been anyone else?" Brody's mouth opened and closed again. No answer came. Vance stepped in, his tone professional but cutting. "Chief Brody, you are hereby placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into your department's practices. Given the number of prior complaints under your leadership, I suspect this hearing is just the beginning." He turned to his aide. "Initiate the audit." The aide stepped forward and placed a thick folder on the table with a heavy thud. The tab read, "Miller, Frank P. Complaint history." Vance flipped it open, revealing a stack of reports so thick it looked like a novel of violence. "Officer Miller's career," he began, "is a study in what happens when a department stops holding its own accountable. In 12 years, he accumulated 38 citizen complaints. Excessive force, unlawful searches, racial profiling, you name it. Every single one dismissed or marked unsubstantiated. Every single one signed off by you, Chief." He didn't need to read from the pages. The list had already burned itself into his mind. In 2015, a 19-year-old student named Marcus Thorne had his jaw broken during a traffic stop. In 2017, a family named Garcia filed a complaint after Miller entered their home without a warrant and terrified their children. He called Mr. Garcia a racial slur. In 2020, a 70-year-old woman was pulled from her car and left bleeding on the pavement because she didn't roll down her window fast enough. Vance's voice was calm but merciless. a surgeon exposing rot, and every time Chief Brody signed off. Every time the department looked the other way, Brody's head fell into his hands. His breathing was shallow, his face ashen. Governor Thompson's eyes were fixed on him, cold and distant. Every one of those incidents, he said quietly, was a debt. You thought ignoring them would make the debt disappear, but it doesn't disappear, Chief. It accumulates. It grows interest. And today your department pays in full. The governor looked to the Attorney General. Arthur, what's the financial damage? Over $1.7 million, Vance replied. In settlements tied to Officer Miller's conduct alone, all quietly approved by the city, with NDAs attached. All sealed until now. Lena finally spoke, her voice clear and steady. And what about the moral damage? The question landed softly but carried far. Every head turned toward her. Moral damage, she repeated. What's the cost of fear? Of a child growing up afraid to see a police cruiser on her street? What's the cost of trust eroded so completely that a woman with degrees, credentials, and a home address still becomes a suspect by existing? Her gaze moved from Brody to Miller to the room itself. You've all been paying that cost. You just didn't realize it until today. The silence that followed was thick with something unspoken. Shame, maybe, or the slow dawning of accountability. Attorney General Vance nodded once, as if acknowledging her words. Governor, he said, we'll need to move forward with a state-level review. Northwood Heights PD will come under full oversight. Good, the governor said. Effective immediately, all state funding to this department is frozen pending that review. This building will be inspected top to bottom. Every complaint, every arrest, every body cam file will be opened. Brody's breath hitched. Governor, that will destroy us. Thompson's expression didn't change. No, Chief, you already destroyed yourselves. I'm just making it official. He turned to the troopers. Take them away. As the officers escorted Miller and Jenkins out, the room's energy shifted. The arrogance that had once filled it was gone, replaced by something colder, an awareness that the system for once had turned on itself. Lena stood slowly, moving to the table where the tablet still displayed the frozen image from the ring footage. Miller's face twisted in rage, pruners raised mid-swing. The moment of violation suspended forever in digital clarity. She looked at it, then at the men being led away. This man told me I needed to learn my place, she said softly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. For years, men like him have decided where people like me belong. In holding cells, in statistics, in silence. She paused, her eyes steady, her words deliberate. But my place is not in your reports. It's not in your chain of command or under your thumb. My place is in lecture halls, in classrooms, on policy boards, beside my husband as we work to build a just state. And your place, she added, turning toward Miller, is no longer behind a badge you've dishonored. Your place is in a courtroom. Your place is in a cell. Perhaps there you'll finally have time to reflect on the lives you've broken. No one spoke. Her words were not angry, they were surgical, precise. A verdict disguised as grace. Attorney General Vance gathered his papers, his voice quiet but firm. This department will be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. No more immunity. No more missing footage. No more excuses. Governor Thompson nodded. And the first thing we rebuild, he said, looking toward Lena, is trust. When the room finally began to empty, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. The precinct that had once felt impregnable now sounded hollow, stripped of its illusion of order. Outside, the late afternoon sun poured through the tall glass windows, catching the dust in the air. It looked almost like smoke, like the aftermath of a fire. Lena and David stood side by side, their reflections mirrored in the glass. You all right? He asked quietly. She nodded. I am now. He studied her face, the calm, the exhaustion, the quiet fire that had carried her through humiliation into history. I should have gotten here sooner. You got here when it mattered, she said. That's what counts. For a moment, the two simply stood together, watching the world outside. It looked the same as it had that morning, trees, cars, manicured lawns, but something fundamental had changed. A wall had cracked. In the parking lot, the black sedan carrying Miller and Jenkins pulled away under escort. Cameras flashed as the first reporters arrived, drawn by whispers of an unprecedented scene inside the precinct. Governor Thompson straightened his jacket and took his wife's hand. "We're not done," he said. "No," Lena agreed, her voice quiet but resolute. "This is just the beginning." They walked together toward the double doors. Behind them, the emblem of the Northwood Heights Police Department hung on the wall, a polished brass shield. In the shifting afternoon light, it no longer gleamed. It looked tarnished, corroded, stripped of its shine, and as they stepped into the sunlight, the sound of the doors closing behind them was more than the end of a meeting. It was the closing of an era. Because from that moment forward, no one in Northwood Heights or in the entire state would ever again be able to pretend that silence was safety or that power without conscience was justice. The reckoning had arrived, and its name was truth. The next morning, the Northwood Heights Police Department was unrecognizable. The sun rose over a parking lot lined with unmarked black sedans, satellite vans, and state cruisers. News reporters clustered at the gates, their cameras aimed at the once imposing building that had served as a fortress for the powerful and untouchable. Now it was surrounded by barricades and troopers in navy blue uniforms, a perimeter not of protection but containment. Inside, the mood was not panic so much as surrender. Every conversation was hushed, every glance furtive. Files were being boxed and carried away by state investigators. Hard drives were seized and tagged for evidence. The men and women who had laughed in the break room the day before now whispered about subpoenas and resignations. On the second floor, in the same hearing room where Miller and Jenkins had been handcuffed less than 24 hours earlier, the atmosphere had shifted again. It no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt like a reckoning chamber. Governor David Thompson stood at the far end of the table, speaking quietly with Attorney General Arthur Vance. Lena sat beside them, calm, her hands folded neatly before her. She had refused the governor's offer to rest at home, insisting on being present for what came next. "If I can stand through humiliation," she had told him, "I can stand through justice." Vance began by addressing the small group of officials assembled, state auditors, federal civil rights observers, and a handful of remaining Northwood Heights officers who hadn't yet been suspended. "We're not here to relive yesterday," he said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a man used to command. "We're here to make clear what happens next." He gestured to a thick file that sat open in front of him, the same one he had dropped on the table the day before. The top of the file was stamped in bold red letters, "Confidential, Internal Affairs." "This," he said, tapping the folder, "is the record of Officer Frank P. Miller, a 12-year history of unchecked violence and corruption." The room was silent except for the faint whir of the air conditioner. "In those 12 years," Vance continued, "he accumulated 38 citizen complaints, 38. Not one resulted in meaningful discipline. Each time the complaint was closed with one of three phrases: unsubstantiated, insufficient evidence, or officer acted within departmental policy." He flipped a page and began to read. Case 17-014, use of excessive force. Victim, Marcus Thorne, age 19. Traffic stop for a broken taillight resulted in hospitalization for a fractured jaw. Officer Miller claimed the suspect assumed a combative stance. The city settled for $150,000. He turned another page. Case 19-032, unlawful entry and verbal abuse. Victims, Garcia family. Officer Miller entered their home without a warrant, pointed a firearm at their children, and used a racial slur. The complaint was dismissed. He looked up. "And these are only the incidents that reached formal documentation. The rest," he said, gesturing toward the unopened section of the file, "are buried in internal memos, redacted reports, or conveniently misplaced evidence." A murmur rippled through the room. Lena watched quietly, her eyes steady on the documents. She'd spent her career studying systemic inequality, writing about the invisible mechanisms that preserved it. But seeing the evidence laid out like this, names, dates, victims, was something else entirely. Each page was a scar on paper, and the collection of them formed a body of proof. This department, Vance said, his tone hardening, didn't just fail to stop him. It empowered him. It rewarded him. And now it will answer for him. Governor Thompson stepped forward, his presence filling the room like a quiet tide. He picked up the file, leafed through it for a moment, then set it down. His voice when he spoke was low but unyielding. "I want to talk about cost," he said. "Not just the moral cost, which is immeasurable, but the tangible one. Every time this department covered for Miller, it wrote another check drawn from the taxpayer's account. Every lawsuit, every settlement, money that should have funded schools, hospitals, and community programs went instead to paying for his brutality. The citizens of this state have been financing their own oppression." He looked directly at Chief Brody, who sat slumped at the opposite end of the table. "Tell me, Chief, did you ever think about that when you signed those dismissals? Did you ever wonder who paid for his mistakes?" Brody's voice was a rasp. "Governor, I was following procedure." "Procedure," Thompson repeated softly as though tasting the word. "That's the problem. Procedure is what cowards hide behind when they don't have the courage to do what's right." The silence that followed was suffocating. Attorney General Vance broke it with the strike of finality. Effective immediately, Chief Brody is removed from his position. The Northwood Heights Police Department is hereby dissolved under state order. Every active case will be reviewed under independent supervision. Every officer with more than 3 misconduct complaints in 5 years is suspended pending investigation. The city will no longer police itself in the dark. Gasps filled the room, but the governor continued before anyone could protest. "I'm also freezing all state funding to this precinct until federal oversight is complete," he said. "This department will be taken apart, stud by stud, wall by wall, and rebuilt into something that actually protects the people who pay for it." A young officer near the back of the room raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, what happens to us? The ones who don't participate?" The governor finished for him. "Then help fix it? You stay, but you answer to the truth now." Not silence, the officer nodded. Visibly shaken, Vance turned toward his aide, who placed a second, thinner folder on the table, this one labeled Citizen Testimonies. "These," he said, "are the voices of people who filed complaints and were ignored. They'll be given a platform now. Every statement, every grievance will be entered into the public record." He looked at Lena. "This is what accountability looks like." "Not vengeance, transparency," Lena stood. The movement drew every eye in the room. She walked slowly to the screen at the front where the final frame of the ring footage was still frozen. The moment Miller's arm swung, his face twisted with hate. She studied it for a long moment before speaking. "This man," she said, her voice calm but resonant, "told me that I needed to learn my place. But the truth is, for far too long, people like him have been the ones defining what that place should be. They've used fear to draw invisible boundaries. Where we can live, where we can walk, how we must behave to avoid becoming targets. They built entire systems around the illusion that they were protecting us when, in reality, they were protecting themselves." Her gaze lifted from the screen to the officers in the room. "But that illusion ends today. Because the power to define our place doesn't belong to men like Frank Miller. It belongs to justice, to truth, to every person who refuses to be silent when the powerful demand obedience." She turned back to the image of Miller. "And as for him, his place is not behind a badge anymore. His place is in a courtroom as a defendant. His place is in a cell where he can finally feel the weight of every life he tried to diminish." Her words hung in the air, steady and final. When she finished, no one clapped. No one dared. The silence itself was the applause, the reverence that follows a verdict delivered not by anger but by truth. Attorney General Vance cleared his throat. "Governor, the federal transport team has arrived. They're ready to take the officers into custody." Governor Thompson nodded. "Do it." Moments later, the sound of boots on tile echoed down the hallway. 2 state troopers entered, escorting Miller and Jenkins in handcuffs. They were no longer officers, no longer guardians of law. They were men stripped bare, faces pale, uniforms replaced with gray holding clothes, They passed Lena without a word, though Miller's eyes flickered toward her once, pleading for acknowledgement. He found none. She didn't hate him, he wasn't worth hatred. She simply looked through him as if he were already part of the past. As the door closed behind them, the weight in the room lifted, not completely, but enough for everyone to breathe. Vance turned to his aide. "Begin the process," he said. "Issue the release to the press. The people deserve to know what happened here." Outside, the cameras were already rolling. Reporters spoke in hushed excitement, headlines forming even before official statements were released. Within hours, footage of the arrest, the same footage that had been hidden and edited, would be broadcast across the nation. Governor's wife, assaulted by police officer in racially charged arrest body cam. Footage exposes corruption in Northwood Heights. PD state launches sweeping police accountability. Reforms by sunset, the story was everywhere. That evening, the governor's mansion glowed under the golden wash of floodlights. The same steps where dignitaries had once gathered for banquets now hosted a press conference unlike any in the state's history. Governor Thompson stood at the podium, his voice measured, his eyes steady beneath the glare of cameras. "Yesterday," he began, "an innocent woman, my wife, was attacked, humiliated, and falsely accused by officers sworn to uphold the law. Today, those officers are under arrest. But this is not just about one woman. It is not even about one department. This is about a culture that confuses authority with infallibility, power with virtue. That ends now." He gestured toward Lena, who stood a few steps behind him. "Dr. Lena Davis has spent her life studying inequality, fighting for fairness. Now her experience has shown us what every ordinary citizen endures when power goes unchecked. Together we will use this moment not for vengeance but for reform." He paused, letting the flashbulbs pop and settle. "Tomorrow we introduce the Dr. Lena Davis Accountability Act, legislation that will bring transparency and integrity to policing statewide. No more vanished footage, no more sealed records, no more patterns of abuse hiding behind bureaucracy." Lena stood quietly beside him, the light glinting off the faint bruise still visible near her wrist. Her face was calm, not triumphant, not vengeful, but resolved. Behind the crowd, the same question lingered in every mind. How had it come to this? How had a man with garden shears and a grudge nearly brought down an entire system? The answer, Lena knew, was simple. It had been broken long before him. He was just the moment it was finally caught on camera. As the press conference ended, the reporters surged forward shouting questions, but Lena didn't stop to answer. She and David walked down the steps together, hand in hand. The crowd parted around them, murmuring, the sound of shutters echoing like distant thunder. For the first time in a long while, she felt the air shift, not with fear, but with something new, accountability. And though she knew the fight ahead would be long, grueling and full of resistance, she also knew that the hardest part was already over. The silence had been broken. Behind her, the shattered systems of Northwood Heights lay in ruin. Ahead of her, the long work of rebuilding justice was about to begin, and somewhere in a gray cell far from the city, Frank Miller sat alone, the echo of his own words haunting him in the dark. "People like you don't belong here." He had been right in a way. He didn't belong there, not anymore. Justice had found its place. The weeks that followed the Northwood Heights incident felt like the aftershock of an earthquake. The world had watched as a police department imploded under the weight of its own corruption. But what no one expected was how quickly the cracks would spread outward, reaching every level of law enforcement across the state. The video of Frank Miller shattering Dr. Lena Davis's car window had become one of the most replayed clips in modern history. It wasn't just the violence that haunted viewers. It was the unbearable contrast between the calm dignity of the woman inside the car and the fury of the man outside it. That image, glass exploding across sunlight, a woman shielding her face, the reflection of a badge glinting like a threat, had become a symbol. And symbols once born had power. Within days, the governor's office was flooded with calls and letters. Survivors of police misconduct began sharing their stories, long buried beneath fear or futility. Communities organized candlelight vigils, University students quoted Lena's words in their protests. "My place is not in your holding cell. It is in the lecture halls, the classrooms, the courts of conscience." The state legislature, once cautious about reform, now faced a moral tide too large to resist. Public sentiment had turned with ferocity, and lawmakers scrambled to align themselves with the momentum Lena had ignited. Governor David Thompson, standing shoulder to shoulder with his wife at press conferences, made good on his promise of systemic change. Together they introduced the Dr. Lena Davis Accountability Act, a sweeping bill that would transform the relationship between law enforcement and the citizens it served. The legislation was ambitious, even audacious. It mandated that every officer's disciplinary record become public. It established a centralized misconduct database accessible to journalists, citizens, and other departments, ending the quiet transfer of problem officers between jurisdictions. It made tampering with or disabling body cameras a felony punishable by prison time, and it created a state-level commission for automatic review of any officer with more than 3 use-of-force complaints in a 5-year span. But the most revolutionary aspect of the bill was its tone. It was not written in the language of punishment but of transformation. Lena had insisted on that. "We are not building a wall of retribution," she told the committee during hearings. "We are opening a window of accountability. This isn't about vengeance, it's about visibility." Her testimony, calm, intelligent, unsparing, was replayed across national networks. Lawmakers from other states began calling, requesting copies of the proposed bill. Civil rights advocates hailed it as the most comprehensive reform in a generation. When the bill passed the Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support, the chamber erupted in applause. Some cried. Even the most jaded lawmakers stood in quiet respect. Outside the Capitol building, hundreds of citizens gathered beneath banners that read, "Justice has a name." Lena watched from the balcony as Governor Thompson signed the bill into law. The pen felt heavy in his hand, but his signature was steady. When he finished, he turned to her, handing her the pen with a faint smile. "This belongs to you," he said. She shook her head. "It belongs to everyone who refused to look away." The ceremony made headlines around the world. But the real work, the hard, unglamorous labor of rebuilding trust, was only beginning. The Department of Justice soon arrived in Northwood Heights, launching an exhaustive federal review of the entire department. They found what Lena and the governor already knew. Years of systemic racism, falsified reports, missing footage, and internal cover-ups. 17 officers were terminated. Several were indicted. Chief Brody, stripped of his title, was charged with obstruction and falsification of evidence. He appeared in court weeks later looking a decade older. His once iron posture had melted into defeat. The trial of Frank Miller and Eric Jenkins drew national attention. Every seat in the courtroom was filled, every word dissected in the press. The prosecution's case was airtight, backed by video evidence, audio recordings, and testimony from victims long ignored. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Guilty. Frank Miller was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Eric Jenkins, whose cooperation and testimony had come late but sincerely, received 8. The judge's closing words were stark and deliberate. "This court finds that power, when corrupted by prejudice, is no longer authority. It is criminality." Outside, the press captured the image that would define the end of the trial. Lena standing on the courthouse steps beside her husband, the wind catching the hem of her coat as she addressed the nation. "Justice," she said, "is not revenge, it's repair. We cannot undo the harm that has been done, but we can ensure it never happens again. We must make truth our policy, not our apology." The speech went viral within hours. For many, it was the first time in years that justice felt tangible, not just a word on paper, but a living promise. Months passed. Northwood Heights, once synonymous with arrogance and fear, began to change. The old police department building was gutted and rebuilt into a new facility under a different name, the Northwood Center for Community Justice. Its new chief, an African-American woman named Alicia Monroe, was a reformer known for her relentless focus on transparency and community engagement. Every officer now wore a body camera synced to a cloud-based backup, monitored by the state. Civilian oversight boards met monthly to review incidents. Complaints were tracked, not buried. And in the middle of all that reform stood Lena. Not as a politician, not as a victim, but as something more enduring. A conscience. She had returned to academia, teaching again at the university. But her lectures now carried a different energy. Students packed into her classes, drawn not only by her scholarship but by her story. She spoke not with bitterness but with clarity, dissecting the anatomy of power, the psychology of bias, the sociology of systems that protect themselves at the expense of justice. Her students often asked her how she'd remained calm that day in the car, how she had managed composure in the face of such cruelty. Her answer was always the same. Because rage, she'd say softly, is a fire that burns everything. But dignity, it's the light that remains. Outside the classroom, her work continued. She co-founded the Civic Trust Institute, a research and advocacy organization dedicated to ethical policing, transparency, and community reform. The Institute's programs trained both officers and citizens in bias recognition, conflict de-escalation, and civic accountability. The results were profound. Reports of police misconduct across the state began to drop. Citizen trust surveys rose steadily. It was slow work, imperfect, ongoing, but it was real. One evening, months after the bill's passage, Lena and David stood together in the garden of the governor's mansion. The gala celebrating the new reforms was underway inside, but they had stepped out into the quiet. The moon hung low over the manicured hedges, silvering the leaves. Fireflies drifted through the air like small floating lanterns. For a moment, neither spoke. Then David broke the silence. "You changed everything, you know." Lena smiled faintly. "We changed it." He shook his head. "No, you gave it a soul. Laws are easy to sign, but courage, that can't be legislated." She turned to him, her eyes soft. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, David. It's doing what's right while you're still afraid." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward her wrists. The faint marks from the handcuffs had faded completely now, leaving only memory. "You never should have had to prove that." "No," she said quietly, "but maybe I was meant to." The sound of laughter and music drifted faintly from the mansion. Inside, dignitaries and activists mingled under chandeliers, celebrating reform, quoting statistics, calling it a new era. But out here, in the stillness of the garden, the victory felt more intimate, less like triumph, more like healing. Lena reached for his hand. "Do you think they'll keep changing after we're gone?" He squeezed her fingers gently. "They'll have to. You showed them how." She smiled at that, small, real, full of quiet peace. Later that night, as they returned inside, she caught her reflection in the tall glass doors. For a fleeting second, the memory returned. Her face in the side mirror of the Mercedes, dirt-smudged, terrified, handcuffed. And now this reflection, strong, whole, free. She didn't turn away. She looked at both memories at once, the woman she had been and the woman she had become, and understood that they were the same person. Broken glass and all, across the state, banners still hung from civic buildings. Justice is accountability. Accountability is love. And in a small federal prison hundreds of miles away, Frank Miller sat alone in his cell, staring through the bars at a strip of gray sky. For the first time in his life, no one was listening to him. No badge, no authority, no one to call him sir, only silence. He thought of the words she had said that day in the hearing room, words that had lodged in his mind like splinters. "Your place is in a cell where you will finally have time to reflect." He was reflecting now. The anger that had once driven him, fueled by ignorance, by resentment, had curdled into something smaller, quieter. Regret. But regret, like justice, came too late. Outside his window, the evening light faded into darkness. Somewhere beyond the walls, the world was changing, slowly, painfully, beautifully, and he was not part of it. Back in Northwood Heights, the new community center hosted its first public forum on bias and reform. Citizens spoke freely. Officers listened. Children played outside while their parents watched from benches lined with newly planted magnolia trees. The same street where glass once shattered under sunlight was now alive with voices. Different voices. Hopeful ones. Lena walked past that street one afternoon on her way to a speaking engagement. The neighborhood was quiet, but in the distance she saw a boy riding his bike, laughing as his mother waved from the sidewalk. The sound of laughter, once impossible here, now filled the air like music. She paused, watching, her eyes soft with memory. Then she whispered something only the wind could hear. Justice isn't what we take back, it's what we build next. And with that she turned and kept walking forward, always forward, into the light of a new day that had finally learned how to listen. The night of the gala was quiet, almost reverent. Inside the governor's mansion, the grand ballroom glowed under crystal chandeliers, the air filled with soft music and polite applause. Yet for all its elegance, the celebration was subdued, thoughtful, more a vigil for change than a party for victory. The people who had gathered there understood that justice was not a destination, but a journey that would require vigilance long after the speeches ended. Dr. Lena Davis and Governor David Thompson stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens, the same gardens where months earlier they had stood in silence, trying to make sense of what had happened. Now the air was cool, washed in silver light. Beyond the manicured hedges, the city of Northwood Heights slept, restless but healing. David leaned against the railing, his voice low. "It feels different tonight," he said. Lena smiled faintly. "Because it is. Are you happy?" She paused, considering. "Happy isn't the word," she said softly. "Relieved maybe, resolved, but happy?" She looked down at her hands, at the faint scars that had long since faded but would never truly disappear. "Justice isn't joy, David, it's peace. And peace takes time." He nodded, watching her quietly. "You gave them that." "You gave them peace," she shook her head. "No, we gave them truth. Peace will come when they know how to keep it." The wind stirred her hair, carrying with it the faint hum of laughter from inside the ballroom. For a moment Lena closed her eyes and listened, not to the applause or the chatter, but to the quiet between it all, the space where meaning lived. Somewhere inside, a string quartet began to play Vivaldi. She smiled at the sound. That same music had been playing the morning her window shattered, a cruel, beautiful symmetry. It was strange how life folded itself like that, tragedy and triumph sharing the same melody. Her mind drifted back to that day, the glass, the heat, the voice that barked orders and hate. And then to the silence after, the moment in the cell when she decided she would not break. That decision had changed everything. She turned to David. "Do you remember what you said that night? After the hearing?" He frowned, thinking. "I said a lot of things. You said the storm has passed." He smiled faintly. "I was wrong, wasn't I?" She nodded. "The storm didn't pass. It changed direction. It started cleansing instead of destroying." They stood in silence for a while, looking out at the city that had nearly broken them both. Below, the reflection of the mansion shimmered in the fountain, a symbol of clarity, renewal, and all the fragile things that could only survive through courage. Inside, the guests were still toasting to the reforms, to the Dr. Lena Davis Accountability Act, now the law of the land, to the statistics already improving, to the hope that what began as an act of hate had become a movement of integrity. But for Lena, the night was not about policy. It was about people, the unseen ones, the single mother harassed in her own neighborhood. The boy pulled over for a broken taillight. The families who had lost trust in the institutions meant to protect them. This victory belonged to them, not to her. She thought of Frank Miller then, locked away in a cell of his own. She did not feel triumph or even satisfaction, only a quiet understanding of how cycles end, how hate once stripped of power withers into its own isolation. He would serve his sentence. He would have time to think. Perhaps someday he would understand the magnitude of what he had done. Perhaps he wouldn't, it no longer mattered. The world had moved on, and so had she. The sound of the quartet shifted to a softer movement, one of reflection and grace. David reached for her hand, his thumb tracing the spot where the cuffs had once bitten into her skin. "It's over now," he said. Lena looked up at the moon, luminous and unbroken. "No," she said gently. "It's beginning." He smiled at her. That same quiet, proud smile he had given her on the day the act passed. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I have to," she said. "Otherwise, everything that happened, every bruise, every scar, was just pain. But if it leads to change, then it becomes purpose." Below them, a breeze rippled across the reflecting pool, distorting their mirrored silhouettes for a moment before smoothing them again. It reminded her of something she used to tell her students, that progress was not a straight line but a rhythm, a tide. It pulls forward, it recedes, and then it comes back stronger. Inside, the applause began again. Speeches were ending. The night was drawing to a close. David turned to her. "Shall we go in?" "Not yet," she said, her eyes still on the horizon. "Just one more moment." They stood together in silence, the kind that only love and survival can share. The moonlight gleamed across the marble railing, turning the night into a portrait of stillness. Lena exhaled softly, her words more breath than voice. "You know, when he broke that window, I thought everything I believed about the world shattered with it. But it didn't. It just revealed what was already cracked." David nodded, his voice almost a whisper. "And you made them see it." She looked at him then, her expression serene. "We made them listen." As the music inside faded into its final notes, Lena and David turned to go. Behind them, the reflection in the fountain shimmered once more, no longer fractured but whole. The world outside was far from perfect, but it was changing. And for the first time in a long time, it was changing toward the light. Because one woman refused to be silent. Because truth once spoken cannot be unlearned. And as the mansion doors closed softly behind them, her voice echoed in memory, a quiet call to those still fighting, still enduring, still hoping. Justice is not the end of suffering. It is the beginning of healing. Speak truth. Share hope.